When Pope Francis died on Easter Monday, April 21st, 2025, everyone started talking about the famous St. Malachy prophecy, because he was believed to be the 112th and final pope. Yet, just a few weeks later, on May 8, 2025, white smoke rose again from the Sistine Chapel, and a new name echoed through the square, Pope Leo XIV. Why did this happen? Was the prophecy wrong, or were we reading it all wrong from the start? In this video, we dig deep into the mysteries behind Malachy's words, the unexpected election of Pope Leo, and what it could all mean for the future of the Church. Before we begin, I'd be honored if you'd click like and subscribe to join the journey as we explore these hidden prophecies. Now, let's uncover the truth behind Pope Leo XIV's rise, and why it matters more than you think. You're about to hear something that very few people talk about anymore, and even fewer actually understand. My name is Dr. Alan Rourke. I'm a religious historian. I've studied Vatican archives, early Catholic texts, and ancient Christian prophecies for more than 40 years. And I've dedicated most of that time to a mystery that still baffles scholars today: the prophecy of the popes. Now, you may have heard the name St. Malachy. He was a 12th century Irish bishop, and legend says that while on a pilgrimage to Rome, he collapsed in a vision. What he saw, supposedly, was a complete list of all future popes, from his day until the end of time. 112 of them. Each pope described not by name, but by a Latin phrase, short, cryptic, often poetic: Pastor Angelicus. From the labor of the sun, the glory of the olive. Strange, right? But here's the thing: when you line those phrases up with real papal history, the match is often disturbing. For example, Pastor Angelicus, the angelic shepherd, perfectly describes Pope Pius XII, who was known for his deeply spiritual presence and mystical experiences during World War II. From the labor of the sun, that one fit John Paul II, born during a solar eclipse and buried during one too. And then we come to number 112, the final one. That title? Peter the Roman. The prophecy says this last pope would feed the flock through great tribulations, and that after his reign, the city of 7 hills, Rome, would be destroyed. And that's where Pope Francis comes in. He was the 266th pope. But more importantly, by most interpretations, he was number 112 on Malachy's list. So when he died in April 2025, many people quietly held their breath. Was this the moment? Was the prophecy about to fulfill itself? But instead, we got something else. White smoke. A name. A new face. An American, Robert Francis Prevost, who took the name Pope Leo XIV. Now I remember the moment vividly. I was sitting alone in my study in Maine, watching the live broadcast from St. Peter's Square. Rain falling. Cameras flickering. The crowd restless. Then the cardinal stepped forward. The name was announced. And I froze. Because according to the prophecy, there wasn't supposed to be anyone after Pope Francis. And yet, here he was. I remember whispering aloud, "Ben, what did we get wrong?" That question haunted me. And not just me. Quietly, in Vatican circles, in prophecy forums, in dusty seminaries and old bookstores, people were asking the same thing. Had the prophecy failed? Or had we misunderstood it from the beginning? I started going back through every translation, every variant manuscript of the St. Malachy list, including one rare 17th century edition I'd photographed in Belgium back in '91. And as I reread the Latin, something started to shift in my thinking. What if the final line, the one about Peter the Roman and the end of the city, wasn't describing Pope Francis at all? What if it was describing someone else? Someone who wouldn't come instead of Francis, but after him? That's when I began to re-examine Robert Prevost. Most people didn't know who he was. But I did. I'd followed his name for years, quietly. He was an Augustinian, a missionary. Spent nearly 20 years in Chiclayo, Peru, walking alongside the poor, building communities, working in silence. He wasn't famous. He wasn't politically connected. He wasn't part of the Vatican inner circle. He read obscure texts. He visited dying priests in the middle of nowhere, and he almost never gave interviews. But once, many years ago, I read a single line he said in a quiet Spanish-language radio interview in Peru. He said, "The end is not always judgment. Sometimes it's simply when silence begins speaking again." That line hit me like thunder, because the prophecy doesn't say the world ends after the last pope. It says the city will be judged, and the silence will return. And I began to wonder, what if Pope Leo XIV wasn't outside the prophecy? What if he was the one the prophecy was actually pointing to? Not a man who ends the world, but the one who carries what was buried before the world was ready. And that's when I started seeing the science. Books that resurfaced. Symbols etched in Peruvian chapels. Whispers about a hidden archive beneath a church in Chiclayo. A sealed room. A brass key. A phrase scratched in stone. Et videbis. And you shall see. I believe Pope Francis was the last public pope in the prophetic line. But Pope Leo XIV? He's the first of something else. Something older. Something silent. And if I'm right, then the prophecy didn't fail at all. It simply ran out of words. Because the rest was never meant to be written. It was meant to be revealed. And now, it begins. The days that followed Pope Francis's funeral were strangely quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes with peace. The kind that feels unfinished. Like someone cut the power mid-sentence, and no one knew whether to whisper or scream. And for those of us who had studied the prophecy of the popes for decades, that silence was deafening. Because Francis was supposed to be the last. The 112th. The shepherd during tribulation. Peter the Roman. That was the end of the line. That's what every version of Malachy's vision told us, or at least, what we thought it told us. And then came Leo. Not a symbolic title. Not a spiritual echo. A full papal election. A new name. A new face. A new flame on the balcony. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if the prophecy had ended, or if we had been reading it all wrong from the beginning. Now, let me be clear about something. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a prophecy historian. That means my job isn't to jump to conclusions, it's to test them. Check manuscripts. Track timelines. Follow the ink as far as it goes. But when Pope Leo XIV appeared, elected by conclave just 2 weeks after Francis was laid to rest, I couldn't ignore what was gnawing at me. Something wasn't over. Something had just begun. And so, I went back, not just to the prophecy, but to Robert Prevost's past. Because I knew if there was anything the St. Malachy list had taught us over the centuries, it was this. The truth is never in the titles. It's in the pattern beneath them. And the pattern around Pope Leo was unlike anything I had ever seen. First, there was his name, Leo, a title historically associated with restoration, theological clarity, and resistance against heresy. The original Pope Leo, St. Leo the Great, stood against Attila the Hun and wrote doctrines that shaped the very core of Catholic understanding for centuries. But this new Leo? He came from silence. Robert Prevost wasn't part of the typical Vatican machine. He wasn't formed in Rome, polished through politics. He didn't climb. He descended, into Peru, into villages, into lives that didn't even show up on maps. He served as Bishop of Chiclayo for 12 years, then briefly in Lima, and then, quietly, was brought to Rome by Pope Francis himself. He became prefect of the dicastery for bishops in 2023. And then, 2 years later, he became the Pope. The first American. The first Augustinian. The first with no red hat. And here's what struck me most. The Malachy prophecy doesn't list names. It lists symbols, images, echoes. And when I started looking, I mean really looking, at Pope Leo XIV's election, the echoes were everywhere. The silence, the stone, the spiral. Let me explain. In one of the final entries of Malachy's list, long before the famous Peter the Roman, phrase, there's a lesser-known version, one preserved in the Giovanni Battista Codex from the 1600s. Most dismiss it as apocryphal, but I've seen it with my own eyes. And buried in the marginalia, scrawled in faded Latin, is a line I never paid much attention to until now. Et erit venit post finum, non coronatus, said Portator. And he shall be the one who comes after the end, not crowned, but the carrier. I can't tell you what it felt like the first time I read that again. It was like hearing an echo from a canyon you thought was empty. Not crowned, but the carrier. That's Pope Leo. Because if Francis was the last in the line of fire, Leo is the one who walks back into the smoke to carry what was left. And the more I studied Robert Prevost's past, the more I realized the signs weren't missing. They were misplaced. In Chiclayo, he had a reputation, not for miracles or speeches, but for visiting places no one else went. He was known to spend hours in forgotten churches, reading strange books in languages most locals couldn't identify. A few whispered that he once sealed off a sacristy and kept a brass key in his pocket for years. Others said he used to say prayers that weren't in the missal, old ones. Much older. There's even a rumor, I can't confirm it, but it's come to me from 3 separate sources, that inside one chapel near Patapo, he carved a phrase into the stone himself. Just 3 words. Et videbis, and you shall see. The same words that appeared above the sealed wall in Chiclayo, weeks after his papal election. The same phrase etched in ancient Latin beneath the baptismal font of a ruined chapel in Eton, a town linked to mysterious Marian apparitions in the 20th century. And then it hit me. Maybe Leo XIV isn't the man the prophecy warns about. Maybe he's the man the prophecy was waiting for. Because prophecy doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And Robert Prevost, Pope Leo XIV, is a whisper that carries weight. He is the first pope who has walked back through the end, not to rule, but to remember. Not to fulfill the prophecy, but to explain it. Or maybe, to carry it forward. Because prophecy, after all, doesn't end with fire. Sometimes, it ends with a key, and the man who knows where it leads. What if the prophecy of the popes wasn't wrong? It was just unfinished. Now, I know that sounds like splitting hairs. But stay with me, because this is where things start to crack open, quietly, and then all at once. You've probably heard the standard version of St. Malachy's list, 112 mottos, each connected, retrospectively, to a pope or anti-pope, ending with Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. That final entry, supposedly tied to Pope Francis, was interpreted by many as the sign of the end, the last shepherd before judgment. After that, silence. Curtain. Amen. But here's the problem. History doesn't do clean endings. In the late 1990s, when I was still a graduate researcher at the Gregorian University, I came across a whisper, just a footnote, really, referencing a lost continuation of Malachy's prophecy. Not from the Benedictine custodians who preserved the original 1595 printed version. This was Augustinian, tied to a cloistered monastery in Lyon. It mentions something called post Petrum, literally after Peter. At the time, I dismissed it. A curiosity. Apocryphal. Maybe even forged. But now I wonder if Pope Leo XIV is not Pope number 113. I wonder if he is Pope number 1. One of a new list. A hidden line. A prophetic hinge. Let's go deeper. In 1572, Jesuit archivist Tommaso Bellarmino wrote an obscure commentary on Obscura Vaticinia, shadow prophecies kept in Vatican vaults and monastic caves. In it, he mentions an unnumbered pope he calls Papa Silens. The silent pope. Not because he lacked a voice, but because his entire papacy would be defined by what he refused to say. No encyclicals in his first months. No grand papal coronation. No public declaration about prophecy or apocalypse. Sound familiar? Robert Francis Prevost, Pope Leo XIV, has done more by saying less than most pontiffs do in a decade. And the more I looked, the more I realized he fits that ancient silhouette exactly. the silhouette of the man who comes not to end the church, but to carry it across a divide no one even realized we were approaching. I want to show you something. You may remember the story of Chiclayo, Peru, where Prevost spent years as bishop. In 2022, 2 years before his election, then Archbishop Prevost made an unannounced trip to Rome. No one talked about it. It wasn't covered in the press. But I confirmed through It wasn't covered in the press. But I confirmed through a retired Vatican librarian that he visited the Pontifical Lateran Library and spent hours alone with restricted materials. The same librarian told me Prevost requested a text by name, Liber Expectationis, the Book of Waiting, a volume associated with lost prophecies from the early Desert Fathers, ones believed too disruptive to be taught. Do you see what I'm saying? This man was reading forgotten prophecies. He was tracing silences. He wasn't preparing to be Pope. He was preparing for something. And when he became Pope Leo XIV, no apostolic letter, no triumphant message to the world, no mention of Malachy, just a blessing, and then silence. But inside that silence, layers. He didn't take a name like Peter II or John Paul III. He took Leo. And Leo, friends, is no accident. It harkens to Pope Leo I, who faced down Attila the Hun with only his presence and a prayer, and to Leo XIII, a pope obsessed with spiritual warfare, with prophecies of division, and with the threat of satanic infiltration at the highest levels of power. By calling himself Leo XIV, Robert Prevost has planted a foot in two worlds, the ancient and the apocalyptic. And maybe that's why he's silent, because he knows exactly where we are and what comes next. So don't ask why the prophecy failed. Ask what part of it we never got to read, and who kept it from us. Because if there's a new list, and Leo is the first name, then we are not at the end of prophecy. We are standing at the beginning of something no one saw coming. Something older, darker, and maybe more necessary than we're ready to admit. Stay with me, because what comes next might explain everything. Now, if you followed me this far, then you already understand we're not in the realm of coincidence anymore. And nowhere was that clearer than in the days surrounding the death of Pope Francis and the silent, almost spectral rise of Pope Leo XIV. It started, if you believe in patterns as I do, not in Rome, not in Chiclayo, but in a village called Loria in southern Italy. April 2nd, 2025. Same day the world first learned that Pope Francis had passed. A local woman, Rosa Bellanti, age 73, enters the church of Santa Maria del Grazie before dawn. She goes to pray before the Marian statue there, a replica of Our Lady of Sorrows, known locally as La Madre che Piange, the Mother who Weeps. And that morning she was not Rosa, the statue, documented, photographed, witnessed by over a dozen people within the hour. Clear, viscous liquid streaming down both cheeks from the Virgin's carved eyes. Laboratory tests confirmed saline, human tear composition. Now, I've covered dozens of weeping statue claims in my life. 90% are frauds. 10% are misinterpretations. But this one happened on the exact morning that Pope Francis died, at the exact time the Vatican press office received confirmation. You think that's nothing? Fine. But that was only the beginning. Hours later, just as the cardinals were preparing for the interregnum, a surge in solar activity disrupted radio signals across parts of Europe, northern Africa, and, most notably, over the Pacific coast of Peru. The flare was strong, but brief, and it caused a full 2-minute blackout in Chiclayo. No internet. No radio. Even the local church bells failed to ring that day, due to a fault in the automated timer system, one that had never failed before in 20 years. Silence. Literal and metaphorical. But the moment that pushed me over the edge, the moment I stopped theorizing and started believing, came 3 days later. April 5th, the day of Francis's funeral. As the world gathered to mourn the 112th Pope, an earthquake, shallow, strange, and unnervingly precise, struck northern Peru. Magnitude 5.7. At the center, less than 30 kilometers from the cathedral in Chiclayo where Robert Prevost had served as bishop. No casualties. No injuries. But windows cracked in the rectory. Stones shifted in the sacristy floor. And a small wooden crucifix, one said to have hung behind Prevost's old desk, was found on the floor the next morning, face down. Now maybe that's just tectonics. After all, Peru is no stranger to seismic activity. But for those of us who've studied the pattern, the symbol, the sequence, it felt like punctuation. Francis leaves. The Virgin weeps. The sun flares. The ground moves. And then he comes. Pope Leo XIV. A pope without a campaign, without visibility, without momentum. A man who walked the margins of the church for decades, elevated suddenly, quietly, universally. No conclave drama. No hesitation. The white smoke rose and within minutes, there he was. And what does he say? Nothing dramatic. No fiery blessing. No call to arms. Not even a word about his predecessor. He simply steps out and looks straight into the camera, into the crowd, into us. And if you've watched that footage, you know what I mean when I say, he wasn't looking at Rome. He was looking at time itself. And time blinked. Let me show you something else. In his first days as Pope, Leo made a series of decisions that didn't register publicly, but to those of us watching closely, they screamed. First, he refused the papal apartments. Instead, he chose to remain in the simple guest house room at Domus Sancti Marthi. The same choice Francis had made, yes, but Leo went a step further. He removed the television, the wall clock, and the crucifix from the room, replaced them with a single object. A worn statue of St. Augustine, one where the heart is missing from the chest. Second, he ordered the removal of certain iconography from the apostolic palace, including a tapestry depicting Peter receiving the keys. No replacement was hung. And third, and this one chills me to my marrow, he has not responded to a single question about the prophecy of the popes. Not one. No press conference. No denial. No clarification. Just silence. Intentional silence. And friends, I'll tell you what I believe. This is not avoidance. It is choreography. It is a man saying everything by saying nothing. There's a passage from the writings of the mystic and Catherine Emmerich. She wrote in 1820, "There shall come one who wears silence like a mantle. He will not break the storm, but walk within it. And the dust behind his steps will reveal what the trumpets failed to say." Tell me that doesn't sound like Leo XIV. He's not Francis. He's not Benedict. He's not John Paul. He is something else. He is the echo of a forgotten line. He is the footstep before the next prophecy. And everything, the weeping statues, the solar signs, the seismic shifts, they are not random events. They are the breathing of an age that knows it is closing. People keep asking, is Leo the last pope? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the real question is, what does the last pope prepare for? Because if prophecy is real, and I believe it is, then it never screams. It whispers. And Pope Leo? He whispers louder than thunder. Let me ask you something personal, because by now, If you've stayed with me this long, I think we've earned a little honesty between us. Do you remember where you were when you heard Pope Francis had died? Not when it was officially announced, not when the broadcasters put it in the crawl at the bottom of your screen. I mean when it hit you, in your chest, in your spine, that the era had changed. That something was gone. I remember I was alone, sitting in a dark room with the television on mute. The rain was falling heavy against the window. The Vatican feed had cut out earlier due to solar interference. Remember that? And in that silence, I felt something strange. Not grief, not dread, but stillness, like the pause between lightning and thunder, like a breath that goes too long without an exhale. And in that moment, I thought, this is it. Because for decades now, centuries, if we're being precise, faithful Catholics, mystics, skeptics, and conspiracy theorists alike have followed the so-called prophecy of the popes. The list attributed to Saint Malachy. The list that claimed to name every pope from Celestine II in 1143 all the way to the very last one, Peter the Roman. The one whose reign, it said, would end with the judgment of the Church and the fall of the city of 7 hills. That motto, in persecution extrema sre sedebit Petrus Romanus, it was never a subtle ending. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't metaphorical. It was final. And that was Pope Francis. At least, that's what we all believed. So you can imagine the chaos, spiritual, theological, emotional, that erupted when the conclave convened again and elected a new pope. Not just any pope, mind you. A quiet man from Peru. A name hardly whispered in betting pools or backroom Vatican talk. A bishop who had spent much of his life in forgotten corners of Chiclayo, ministering to the poor, reading Augustine by candlelight, walking through earthquakes barefoot. Robert Francis Prevost. And suddenly, there he was, Pope Leo XIV. I remember watching him step onto the balcony. Not in white and gold fanfare. Not with the polished smile of media-savvy charisma. He looked still. Waited. And again, that word returned to me. Stillness. And that's when I asked the question that became the root of this entire exploration. If the prophecy said the world would end with Pope Francis, then why are we still here? Some would say it means the prophecy was wrong. But I've spent most of my adult life studying prophecy, not just Malachy's, but Fatima, Akita, La Salette, Garabandal, and more ancient codices than I can count. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Prophecies don't fail. People fail to understand them. See, most of us want prophecy to be a calendar, a countdown, an answer key. But prophecy is almost never about timing. It's about preparation. It's a warning, a window, sometimes even a mercy. It doesn't always speak in thunder. Often it whispers. And it rarely tells you what to expect. It tells you what to prepare for. And that's why I don't think the world didn't end after Pope Francis. I think it began to end long before. I think we've been walking through the unraveling for years now, mistaking the long, quiet collapse for stability, because it's slow, because it's polite, because it doesn't announce itself with fire, but with numbness, loss of meaning, loss of truth, loss of trust, the silence of the sacristy, the fracturing of the faithful, the roar of confusion drowning out the voice of conscience. And then comes Pope Leo, silent, watchful, not speaking what he knows, not arguing, not correcting, just carrying, as if his entire pontificate is a kind of final gesture, not a reign, but a relay. And here's what I think, what I fear, and what I hope. Maybe he was chosen not to lead, but to stand, to be the final presence before the gate closes, to be the one who holds something ancient long enough for the rest of us to finally see it. Or maybe he's not the end at all. Maybe he's the bridge. Maybe St. Malachy's list was never incomplete, just misread. Or maybe, as some ancient commentaries whispered, there was always a second scroll, a sealed continuation, a new line of names that begins not with Peter, but with Leo. And maybe Leo carries a line of popes who are not rulers, but guardians, who do not speak, but listen, who do not bring answers, but bear the weight of a church that no longer knows how to weep. So why are we still here? Why hasn't it all collapsed? Why do the bells still ring and the saints still stand? Maybe because God is giving us more time. Maybe because the storm is still gathering. Maybe because the man in white from Chiclayo, the one who says so little, has been holding something for us. Maybe he carries the silence of judgment not to condemn us, but to delay what we no longer know how to stop. And if that's true, if he really is the first of something new, then we are not living in the wake of the prophecy. We are living in its unfolding. So what do you believe? Was Pope Francis the final pope? Or is Pope Leo the quiet beginning of something we haven't even named yet? Backhand index pointing down. I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell me what you believe. Thumbs up if this story opens something in you, like it did in me. Click that like button. It helps this reach others who are searching for truth in the noise. Bell, and if you want more stories like this, deep dives, honest questions, and mysteries the world's too distracted to see, subscribe. Join the community. Because I promise you this, there are still stories to tell, and the next one is already whispering.